Welcome everybody. We are going to start because it is 12 o'clock and we've got a tight agenda for our hour together. My name is Guhan Subramanian. I'm the faculty chair for the Harvard Law School Program of Negotiation. I want to welcome you all to our session today. I'm thrilled to be saying a few words at the beginning, and then I'll turn it over to Susan Hackley. I want to first of all thank Diane Long and Anna Chang for organizing us and convening us today. There are some on this conference who are not from PON, so I'll just say very briefly that the Program of Negotiation has been a real force in the world of negotiation for 40 years now. It is a consortium, as many of you know, between Harvard, MIT, and Tufts, and other Boston area schools. Our mission is to improve the theory and practice of negotiation around the world, and we do that through our teaching, but maybe more importantly through our research, and that's why we're here today. The Research Fellows Program at PON is a very important part of what we do overall. Our work, our activities are all grounded in the research, and we're going to hear two presenters today who are the very best of what PON has to offer in the research agenda. In my classes at Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School, students sometimes ask me if they can eat during class. You can absolutely eat during class today, so feel free to bring your lunch. I have my lunch here, so I'm going to eat as well. But I will welcome Aria, Ritz, Finkelstein, who will present on One Ocean, One Planet, and also Rob Grace, who will present on his research, Negotiating Humanitarian Access in Armed Conflict. So with that, thank you all for joining. I'm going to turn it over to Susan Hackley, the Managing Director of PON.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm the Managing Director of the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. Just a few comments before we get started. This session will be recorded, and we will post a recording on the PON events page on our website in a few days. We will also share the slides via email after the session. Today, we have two presenters. Each session will be about 30 minutes, and it will consist of presentation plus Q&A. Please remain muted throughout the session so we don't hear any background noise. If your internet speed is slow, you may want to turn off the video. That improves the quality. If you have a question for the presenters, use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and there'll also be time near the end of the session where you can use the raise your hand function, and the speaker may call on you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Aria Ritz Finkelstein. She is a graduate research fellow at the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School, and she is a PhD candidate at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. She's also a guest student in marine policy at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Her dissertation focuses on negotiations leading towards an international, legally binding instrument governing the use of biodiversity on the high seas. As a PON fellow, she has drawn from negotiation theory to understand how the ambiguity of terms like biodiversity can either facilitate or inhibit agreement. Thank you. Aria?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all today. One moment, I'm going to share my screen so you can see the presentation. Okay. So right now, and for the past 2 years or so, these negotiations have been going on at the United Nations to develop an international treaty on the high seas biodiversity. The process building up to these negotiations has been much longer than that, of course. And the talks are meant to lead to a new legal instrument that builds on the Law of the Sea Convention. And the point is to establish framework for managing high seas biodiversity. So it's too soon to say what the outcome of them is going to be in the end, but they have the potential to shape how we deal with marine genetic resources, how we create some kind of comprehensive spatial system for managing high seas ecosystems, and how we ensure that high seas resources are distributed equitably. So the elements of this treaty, they make up what's called a package deal, which means that all 4 of its elements have to be agreed on for an agreement to be reached. So there's no picking and choosing between these elements. Okay, So I've been focusing specifically on one part of the sea, which is the mesopelagic zone. It's also called, less formally, the ocean twilight zone. And it's called that because it's the part of the sea that only receives a very little bit of light. Typically, we think of it as the zone between 200 and 1,000 meters deep. There are a lot of really strange, weird animals there. This is one example. It's really cool. It's called a viperfish. It's about 1 foot long, and we think that they live about 30 to 40 years, although we're not sure. And it lures in prey with its lights, and it opens up its huge mouth. So you can see this huge bottom jaw that it has, and it actually wouldn't be able to close its mouth if these teeth didn't come up over its face like that. Here are a few very strange creatures from the Twilight Zone, and we still know relatively little about these, but we're starting to study them more and more closely. We do know that they make up a ton of biomass, and they might offer an enormous opportunity for sources of nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals, to the extent we don't know yet. Here's an animation of what we call the diel vertical migration. So all of these organisms, they rise up at night to feed, and then they lower back down during the day for protection in the dark. And this up and down movement, we often call it the greatest migration on Earth. It plays a really large role in pulling carbon down to the bottom of the sea, and it sequesters it there for a really long time. So these organisms have a huge role in global carbon cycles and their potential to provide people with really important food and medication resources. So managing them and balancing between these two resources is really important. So there's the question of how we do that. And when I first started researching how a high seas instrument might apply to the Twilight Zone, I was really interested in how the framing of this problem might open up some solutions but foreclose others. In policy scholarship, there's this concept of a generative metaphor, or a metaphor that frames a problem in a certain way. And this does open up certain solutions. And throughout these talks and throughout the informal conversations surrounding them, the metaphor of the ocean as a body or as a single entity has been a really common one through language like one ocean, one planet, hence the title of my presentation. Here, for example, so William Beebe, who was the first to actually explore the Twilight Zone, this was in the 1930s, he described it in his book about the trip, and he wrote, "We should realize the amazing similarity to a living organism, which water makes of this earth of ours. We know how blood courses through our veins and arteries carrying off the waste matter and bringing oxygen and renewed life to all of our tissues. When we turn on the water in the faucet, the simile to a bloodstream seems rather far-fetched, but let us carry out the idea." And he keeps going, discussing this relationship of the ocean to a body, to a human body. He stresses this framing, but he also warns against taking it too far. So he's comparing the planet as a whole to an anatomical system. And there are a few metaphors that are related to this image that have been emerging in high seas negotiations. And each one presents a slightly different or even a very different take on what kinds of solutions we might come up to deal with the high seas problems and how we even think about these problems in the first place. So I'm going to touch on some of these just in very broad strokes to illustrate. So one metaphor, which I mentioned, is as a carbon pump. And a pump, of course, is something that moves things up and down mechanically, right, faster than it would flow on its own. So we also speak about this as a shunt. You can see that yellow image in the diagram represents a shunt. So these organisms, they produce waste particles, and these particles aggregate and they move to the ocean floor much faster than they would if the organisms weren't there. And the organisms also die, and they move down to the bottom of the sea, also sequestering carbon. So what we call this is the gravitational pump when they fall, or the biological pump when they swim. And this is the shunt, which is, of course, a medical metaphor that sees the ocean as a sort of body that we're mechanically helping out. So if we look at the problem of the high seas as maintaining this function, sort of pumping bodily materials down to the bottom of the sea, then the solution to our high seas problem might be about how to maintain this pump going. So we might be looking at how to manage Twilight Zone fisheries, for example, as a major challenge here. Another metaphor is of the circulatory system. So we can think of the oceans as something that moves nutrients around the world through currents and through animal corridors. So if the problem is to maintain these movements, then we need to understand migratory corridors, biogeography, and so on. In particular, how these movements change across territorial boundaries. And you can see in this image how these are changing. We see one from 2005 to 2008 and one how we predict it to look in 2090. And these biogeographies are shifting not only throughout the ocean, but in and out of national territories. So if we're using the metaphor of a circulatory system that produces images like this, then our major problem could be how to manage these things across territorial boundaries, which means that the animals are moving in and out of different legal systems and through different management regimes. So we need to figure out how to coordinate between these. There's also this sort of broader, more, a less sort of immediate metaphor, but this circulatory metaphor, we also see it as a way, people talk about it as a sort of connective tissue between different countries. And this is something, because it ties all of us together, this framing is more socio-political than ecological per se, and it sets up this problem of the sea's resources as the common heritage of mankind, which is a big point of the law of the sea. And then our problem might be that right now the distribution of these is inequitable. So how do we create international agreements for distributing them more equitably between countries? And in the case of the mesopelagic, this might mean how to devise a new legal instrument that allows developing states to reap the benefits that right now only the wealthier, more developed countries have the technology and the financial ability to access, because it's very expensive to extract resources from these spaces. So none of these metaphors is exactly right or wrong compared to the others, but each focuses attention on a certain problem of the mesopelagic while diverting attention from some of the others. So I'll bring Aldo Leopold here. He was roughly a contemporary of William Beebs, who was visiting the Twilight Zone, and he wrote some words that I think are very relevant here. He's describing land management, but it still applies, I think. And he talks about how the landscape, like the configuration of our own bodies, has a certain wholeness. No one censures a man who loses his leg in an accident or who was born with only 4 fingers, but we should look askance at a man who amputated a natural part on the grounds that some other is more profitable. So he's talking about landscapes as the sort of unified whole where removing a piece of them upsets the balance of the entire system. And this thinking an ecosystem, you know, it's an entirety and human actions can really ruin it if we're not thinking of it in a holistic way. And this kind of metaphor, looking at an ecosystem through the lens of ecosystem services is just, it's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. But on the other hand, he talks about it as a machine. So he writes, "This is the age of engineers. For proof of this, I look to the farmer boy tending his tractor or building his own radio. No one dreamed 100 years ago that metal, air, petroleum, and electricity could coordinate as an engine. And few today realize that soil, water, plants, and animals are an engine, subject like any other to derangement." So in this thinking of his, these ecosystems are a sort of machine, and we can tinker with their functions in a more mechanical way until everything's working properly. So we have these two metaphors that in some ways are in tension with each other, but maybe we can integrate them. So this, I can't resist using this cartoon, which really describes how people are thinking about the wholeness of the body. So on one hand, on the left, we see the earth is sick. And the cause of that in this cartoon is the failure of global environmental agreements. And in a sense, so if the earth is a machine, if we misuse it, we can break it. But if we understand how its engine works, we can also maintain it. So here we have, first, the need to maintain adaptive capacity so that as one component of the engine breaks, due to climate change, for example, we can fix it or replace it. But on the other hand, we need an international agreement that's strong enough to maintain this coherence or a wholeness so that the body maintains its health. But it's very challenging to design a legal instrument that's both strong and enforceable, but doesn't become overly rigid. So it has to stay flexible without becoming essentially meaningless. And especially as our changing climate changes marine ecosystems and their particular ranges in space, it becomes more and more obvious to everyone that we need a legal structure that can do that. So one thing that Leopold uses or draws upon to integrate his metaphors is this idea of natural curiosity, which we can also think of as science. And he argues that the key to conservation is acting not out of fear, but out of curiosity about these mechanisms. So I'll read this quote because I think it's important. He writes, in a surprising number of, let's say, people, there burns a curiosity about machines and a loving care in their construction. This bent for mechanisms, even though clothed in greasy overalls, is often the pure fire of intellect. Our present skill in the care of mechanical engines did not arise from fear lest they failed to do their work. Rather, it was born of curiosity and pride of understanding. So as I've been researching and writing, I'm becoming more and more convinced that this importance of the curiosity and science is something that really can integrate these two conflicting or in tension with each other metaphors about the high seas. And it's really brought me to the question of scientific research. So what I'm describing today is partly my change of course in research rather than my findings per se. Now in the BB&J talks and the talks about biodiversity on the high seas, there are really important ways in which people are working to embed scientific research into this legal instrument. One example from the treaty's draft text, state parties shall promote international cooperation in marine scientific research and in the development and transfer of marine technology. And one thing that can be really the focal point of this agreement is science diplomacy or scientific collaboration. First of all, without scientific collaboration, there's no way for states to actually implement the other components of the agreement. And as we know from other agreements, science can actually act as a platform for collaboration because networks of scientists often act as a cultural bridge between the parties involved. So how scientific collaboration can be an important contributor here is one policy question that people are really starting to talk about more and more. But there's still a large gap here, right? Because when people talk about scientific research in this context, they almost always mean physical science. Social scientists that are active in the process are often studying what's already been laid out rather than helping to find the problems that need to be looked at. In some cases, they're even relegated to acting as sort of public relationships or public relations or advocacy, or the facilitators of meetings, but people don't usually see them as the ones who frame the problems in order to figure out what their solutions might be. So what I'm trying to understand now is how social scientists can help set research agendas on the stage, rather than just responding to the ones that physical scientists or policymakers have already set. So one example of what I'm talking about, this map is an image of ecologically and biologically sensitive areas and the workshops that help decide these. So these are marine regions defined under the conventional and biological diversity. And for each region, there's this international workshop in which a group of experts, and these are physical scientists, they designate areas that are important that meet this certain amount of criteria that you see on the left. And these criteria, they're all ecological criteria. None of them are social criteria. So while social scientists have been involved in designing the processes for these, the questions being asked here of people surrounding these maps, drawing lines, they're physical science ones. So at this point, it's really too late for social scientists to help set the problems from which the rest of the policy agenda is flowing. So if we think of our ocean as a sick body, maybe all of our physical scientists are deciding on what the patient's problem is, but maybe they haven't waited until our social scientists are back from lunch, and our social scientists won't get back until it's time to solve the problem, rather than identifying what the problem was in the first place. And this gap of social science, it's a gap that people are working to fill. Folks have been involved in involved research in marine planning, especially coastal, and they've been laying out research agendas that are really ambitious, but they're still young. there's a lot of questions here that haven't even begun to be answered, and they're not really being asked enough in the context of the BB&J process. So if I switch metaphor worlds for a moment, we have some social frames already in use at the BB&J talks that we can look at. So here we have this building metaphor, right? The draft text of the treaty is full of building related metaphors. Here we have framework, which is one that's in frequent use. Foundation is too. And foundation implies a sort of solid thing that you could build something on, but the framework metaphor implies a more open structure, and it supports different things or brings different things together into a whole. So to integrate these two, the key is to come up to an agreement that is strong, legally speaking, so that it can be effective, but at the same time, it's more of a framework, which allows it to stay more flexible, which is important as I mentioned, as ecological conditions mean that species ranges are shifting with regards to territorial boundaries and so on. So then the main question from a policy perspective is, how do you achieve this rigor without sacrificing the adaptive capacity, and vice versa? Another building related metaphor that we have is undermine. Undermine means to weaken a foundation, of course. It's a term that runs throughout the draft treaty, the draft text of the treaty, and whose meaning is still really unclear. Over and over, there's this wording that the new legal instrument should or shall not undermine existing instruments, right? The question is, does undermine mean weakening the authority of existing instruments, or does it mean undermining or weakening the strength of the regulations that existing instruments put in place? And these two senses of undermine are really, really opposed to each other. So then there's the question of this opposition. Is it actually a deliberate opposition in the sense of constructive ambiguity to sort of keep negotiations moving without putting a wall in front of them? And if so, will it help us reach an agreement that is both strong and flexible in the end? So if we go back to the question of problem setting, I'm realizing that what the focus of research here really needs to be is understanding how metaphorical language that's embedded in policy language, it needs a social science bent, not just an emphasis on physical science research. So for example, the metaphors I started with the body, the sea as a body, these all come out of physical sciences to frame issues for diplomacy. And it's important for social science to look at those, but the studies of this process are still lacking the metaphors that social scientists are using to construct social science problems. For example, the question of what undermine means, that's a move in the right direction, but we need to spend more time looking at these problems. And there's already a fair amount of discussion about how science diplomacy works in international negotiations, but there's much less research into how social science diplomacy might be able to work, and that's a big hole. And it can help us think about how social science research networks can bridge between different delegations or different states, and how they might work more like physical science diplomacy in that sense, not only to answer its own research questions, but also to set the problems and the questions that are on the international agenda. So that brings me to some final research questions. What has been the role of social scientists in setting the problem of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction? While these original metaphors that I've introduced have been good examples of policy metaphors, what other ones are there? And how do these bring out ideologies and positions of parties and even options for resolving their different frames? How do these policy frameworks that were adopted early on in the process, how have they set the problems that the negotiations are intended to solve? And out of these problems, how have the design and the agenda of these negotiations been shaped? So in the case of high seas negotiations, what have these social science metaphors highlighted and left out, and how are policymakers understanding these? And then if we come back to the building metaphor, because these questions are already being better understood in coastal ecosystems and coastal marine social science than they are in the high seas, What lessons can we apply from coastal management to examining policy frames and to designing a legal instrument on the high seas, not just the coastal seas, that is both strong and flexible? So in other words, how are social science issues being framed and setting the problems that we need to be working to solve? I think I have another minute. This is a digression, but let me take a moment to talk about it. I think that what's going on in the US has been on most of our minds right now, or at least some of our minds, and it's been a little bit hard to focus on our specific research per se. But reading the news, it's been really impossible for me not to notice the role of framing and metaphor. It's really just been glaring, and it makes the point about problem setting better than I could ever do. These screenshots are just a few examples. I wasn't looking for them. I just, I was scrolling through Twitter, maybe for the duration of about 10 minutes. And these are just popping out all over. There are countless ones like these that are framing the problems that are going on in the US right now in different ways, either to reframe what's happening or to call attention to how others are reframing them in a misleading way. So we have some of these that frame the police in the US as rioters, and that framing counters the narratives that protesters are instigating violence. We have some of these that reframe racism, structural racism, as a public health issue, and that opens up ways that we should be responding to it structurally rather than in an ad hoc way, the way that we tend to do now. And it illustrates that our priorities are wrong right now by, and giving wealth to corporations rather than to people who can't afford rent. So this public health metaphor is talking about how to change social systems as a whole. And then we have some of these frames that actually call attention to the way that others frame things, perhaps inaccurately or not constructively. So for example, some of these writers, they criticize the framing of property damage as the destruction of community. And they, in criticizing that framing, they're reframing property damage as a legitimate protest. Whatever your opinion is, you can see that kind of communication at work. So these metaphors and framings, they're not about oceans, but they are about metaphors that activists and organizers are using in very intentional, explicit ways to define problems. And they highlight how the way that we define these problems can justify destruction, oppression, and perpetrating inequality, while setting it differently can actually reveal a broken system and drive home the urgency and the moral right involved in stopping structural violence. So thank you everyone for walking through this process with me. And I think I have a few more minutes. I would love to take questions or comments. And here my email address is up. So if you don't have time to take questions right now, please contact me if you'd like to talk more. Susan and Diane, I'm not sure if I can actually see hands up right now.
Aria?
Yes.
There are a couple of questions in chat.
Great.
You can see.
Yes, here they are. Okay. Hi, Mackenzie. Animals in the Twilight Zone, when they rise up. So at the top of the ocean, we have more plants who photosynthesize the same way that land plants do. And a lot of the animals, when they rise up, they eat those. And those animals also produce waste in the same way that humans do. And some of the lower down animals actually eat that waste as it falls. And it seems that we can make medicine from those animals. And that's research that's really going on right now. And we don't exactly know what the possibilities there are, but we might be able to find all kinds of treatments there that we haven't even thought about, that we haven't even been able to discover yet. And the circulatory system, it is changing when the oceans heat up, less during hurricane season and more due to climate change as the entire ocean warms and changes the current by which things are moving around. Thank you for the question.
Hey, Aria, can I just suggest we should probably move on to the second presentation, but I thought that the comment from Mihai Isman was a good one, which is to say, could you just, in the last 30 seconds, clarify what the negotiation angle is here and the connection to negotiation? And then we can move on
Also,
to...
what is the new finding?
The negotiations framing here, I apologize for not making it clear enough, is that right now, physical scientists are the ones that are really involved in these sort of bridging networks and in setting the problems that negotiators are addressing when we talk about the high seas. And what I'm finding is that while social scientists are involved, they're involved too late in the process, and they're not involved in how we think about the entire agenda.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Aria. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for sharing your email address. People can follow up with more questions. Now
I'd love to hear from you. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Now it's time to shift to our second presenter, Rob Grace. Rob is a graduate research fellow at the Program on Negotiation, a peace scholar at the United States Institute of Peace, and a doctoral candidate in political science at Brown University. He conducts research on the politics of humanitarian action for the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Brown University. His work has been published by Negotiation Journal, Journal of Conflict and Security Law, World Health and Population, the European Society of International Law, Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, the Foreign Policy Association, and Foreign Policy in Focus. Rob, we're so glad to have you here.
Thanks very much. I almost forgot to unmute myself, but I'm glad I remembered. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everyone for joining. I'm going to set the scene for my topic today with some good news and some bad news. I'm going to start with the bad news. The bad news is that the scale of humanitarian needs in the world today are extremely high. The UN predicts that this year, 167 million people will be in need of humanitarian services. It's as if you took the entire human population of the world at the time of the founding of the Roman Empire and considered that everyone at that time was starving to death or in need of medical services that they could not access or suffering from malnourishment or forced displacement. The good news is that there's a multi-billion-dollar industry of humanitarian organizations whose job it is to try to meet these needs. There are UN agencies, international NGOs, as well as local NGOs. Those are a couple down there that I encountered in my field work in Ukraine, as well as the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. So in order for these organizations to undertake their work, to implement their programs, they need to negotiate with the governments, armed groups, other actors that control territory so that they can actually access vulnerable populations that they're trying to serve. And these access negotiations can be very challenging and very vexing. There's more good news there in that there's been a serious investment in humanitarian negotiation capacity building from a variety of organizations. The Harvard Humanitarian Initiative is one of them, and I've been involved in their work on that. There are humanitarian negotiation handbooks that have popped up. But there's more bad news here in that there are two big shortcomings with these capacity building efforts. One is that there's much more that could be drawn from negotiation scholarship and negotiation theory and applied to the humanitarian field. The bridge between these two fields has started to be built, but it remains in its infancy. The second issue is that there's very little comparative analysis that's been done on humanitarian negotiation processes. So we actually don't know very much about why humanitarian negotiations unfold in different ways in different contexts. So we could look at Syria, where access obstruction has been very persistent, very severe, and compare it to Ukraine, where it's by no means a perfect access environment, but the government has overall adopted a more enabling approach toward humanitarian access negotiation. And we don't really have a good explanation of why that variation exists. So I laid out these issues in a couple pieces. I wrote one, an article published earlier this year by Negotiation Journal, which is published by PON, and also a conference paper that I co-authored with Aldo Leopold, who's on the PON Executive Committee, and I presented this research last year at the annual conference of the International Association for Conflict Management. So what I'm going to talk about now is my doctoral project, which aims to address both of these issues. So here is the framework that I'm taking from negotiation theory and applying to the humanitarian field. It's the Negotiators Dilemma, which I'm going to tweak and build on, and I call it the Humanitarian Negotiators Dilemma. So those of you out there on this call who are experts in the field of negotiation, you know this framework very well, but I'll lay it out for those who might find it useful. The notion that underlies the framework is that there are two overarching approaches to negotiation. One is distributive, meaning that you're going into a negotiation and you're making threats, you're applying pressure, you're basically trying to bully your way through the negotiation. It's how I think our current president tries to negotiate. The other option is integrative, which is much more collaborative. You're trying to build a relationship with your counterpart. You're being very open about your interests and what your bottom line is. You're working together to try to find a deal that will work for both sides. You won't shy away necessarily from yielding to pressure. It's how I think of our previous president, how he tries to negotiate. So in a humanitarian negotiation, if you consider a humanitarian worker negotiating with a government, both sides, the humanitarian and the government, have a choice between these two options. So I'm going to use this framework to make predictions about humanitarian access outcomes. So I'm going to predict that if both parties come in with an integrative approach, what we should see as a result of the negotiation is a government that is overall facilitating access, but with some constraints. And I predict this because if both sides are being integrative, both sides are coming in into the discussion, negotiating in good faith, they're being very open, they're being very collaborative, but in such a scenario, the humanitarian might find that it yields a bit to what the government wants in ways that actually conflict with what the ideal would be for the humanitarian. So if the humanitarian takes an integrative approach and the government takes a distributive approach, I would predict that the outcome would be one of access obstruction, but somewhat constrained access obstruction. There will still be access, but I would expect to see it more controlled by the government side. And this is because the humanitarian in this scenario is coming in trying to be very open and collaborative and about relationship building. The government is coming in and applying pressure and being very duplicitous in its negotiation, taking advantage of the openness on the humanitarian side. So you might think that the integrative approach is too risky for the humanitarian. Perhaps the humanitarian should really go for a distributive approach. And in many ways, this is actually what the humanitarian would very much like to do, to go into a negotiation and say, hey, this is the way it's going to be. We're going to implement this program the way we want to on your territory. It's going to be in line with humanitarian principles. It's a take it or leave it option. And if you say no or try to push back, we're going to withdraw from this context and publicly denounce you, and it'll be a PR disaster for you. And in fact, if the government comes in with an integrative approach, and the humanitarian comes in with a distributive approach, I do expect that to be the best outcome for access and for the humanitarian. But if both sides take a distributive approach, this is the worst outcome for the humanitarian. It's where I would expect to see obstruction be the most extreme. The reason being that both sides are coming in trying to apply pressure. Tensions escalate during the engagement, and it could lead to the humanitarian actually losing access altogether. So that's the logic of the framework. It's essentially a prisoner's dilemma for negotiators, in which one party's best option depends on what the other party does. So I'm going to build on this a little bit. I'm going to hang a couple additional elements onto it. One thing I'm going to do is make a prediction about what is likely to drive the government's decision about its approach. And I'm going to predict that it's all about geopolitics. I'm going to predict that a government that is aligned with the West will be more likely to take an integrative approach. And a government that is not aligned with the West will be more likely to take a distributive approach. And my rationale is that the humanitarian sector is largely Western in its identity and its nature. It initially arose from the West in the 1800s. It's largely funded by Western governmental donors. On the humanitarian side, I'm going to consider that there are individual factors that can affect the choice. There are also organizational factors as well. But I'm not going to try to make a prediction here. I'm considering these factors to be exogenous to my theoretical framework. I'm just going to observe different approaches that humanitarians have taken and see how they play out in different contexts. So the two cases that I'm looking at and undertaking qualitative analysis on are the two I mentioned earlier. Ukraine is my Western aligned case. Syria is my non-Western aligned case. And I see when I map the framework onto these cases that it matches the framework. The Syrian government has absolutely taken a distributive approach. They've exerted a lot of pressure on humanitarian organizations. They've been very duplicitous, haven't negotiated in good faith. They have spied on humanitarian negotiators during negotiations. And in Ukraine, the situation is very different. We see the government has taken a much more open and collaborative approach in its engagements with humanitarian organizations. And again, far from a perfect access environment in Ukraine, there's much that one could say about it. And certainly times when humanitarian organizations have gone on to the distributive side of the orientation and exerted pressure and have had some successes in those efforts. So there you go. That's my framework. I think it can be useful to apply to humanitarian settings as an analytical tool for explaining some of the variation that we see across contexts, as well as a practical tool for humanitarian negotiators to use as they are planning their negotiations and their work. You might think, hey, Rob, you just cherry-picked these two cases. How do I know anything that you're saying is generalizable? So my doctoral project is a mixed methods project, qualitative case studies of Ukraine and Syria, but I'm also building an original humanitarian access data set that will include every Civil War context in the post 9/11 era, so we can see if the insights from this framework hold across a wider scope of contexts. I'll end by just offering a few comments about my broader research agenda in this area. I mentioned a couple pieces that I wrote. Wanted to flag another one published earlier this year that I wrote that focuses on the role of international law and humanitarian principles in the discourse of humanitarian negotiations. Another one of mine coming out in this journal that focuses on negotiations around operational security for humanitarian organizations. And another issue I've been looking at with a co-author is the relevance of the identity of the negotiator, him or herself, and how that shapes and influences how the negotiation process unfolds. I presented some of these findings just a couple of weeks ago at a virtual roundtable that the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative convened. One important thing I want to note about all of these efforts and the overwhelming majority of analysis that's been produced on humanitarian negotiation is that it focuses on contemporary cases. There's been very little examination of historical cases. So I will be aiming to fill that gap and correct that over the next couple of months. As a summer fellow at the program on negotiation, I'll be continuing my collaboration with Aldo Leopold, and we will be producing a case study of Henri Dunant as a humanitarian negotiator. He was one of the founders of the Red Cross in the 1800s. Also notable is his very impressive facial hair. But I suspect our case study will focus more on his negotiation skills than his facial hair. I'll leave you with this comment. I wrote something about this a couple months ago that was published. In the era of COVID-19, I think that one can consider that we are all humanitarian negotiators, in that many of us have been having conversations with friends, loved ones about taking social distancing seriously, wearing masks, navigating what level of risk is acceptable to take. And these conversations and these decisions can potentially have large-scale life or death ramifications for ourselves and for others. So I want to flag that as a final comment, that these tools and these ideas that have been developed over the past couple decades for humanitarian negotiators specifically, we can consider that they're applicable to us all now. I'll leave you with that. Thank you all very much. I'm looking forward to some questions. I'm going to take a look at the chat here. Also, people can raise their hands. I think I saw a hand raised. And if you raise your hand and you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, or someone can unmute you, I think. I'm not sure, someone will tell you. Let's see, I just saw a hand go up, but now I don't see it. Well, let me just, I see some written questions in here. So let me go to those. Let me go to those first, or I'll go to one of these first, and then I'll see if I can figure out how to get to these hands. But okay, Yuri writes, Rob, very interesting topic. Thank you. Do you know if the outcomes of the negotiations can be influenced by the type of humanitarian NGOs? Any differences between global NGOs, regional ones, and national humanitarian entities when they negotiate with governments? Thanks. Yuri, that's the comment. Thank you for your question, Yuri. I'm just going to take a sip of water, then I'll answer the question. So, absolutely, there are differences across organizations and across types of organizations. So I'll flag a couple things that I found in my research. One is that in certain contexts, it can be for a global organization such as the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, or Doctors Without Borders, MSF. it can be that the global nature of the organization can be a benefit, an asset in obtaining in obtaining access. Because with that global nature and with sort of decades of work in this field comes a sense that of legitimacy on the organization. But another important aspect is, how do international organizations interact with local organizations? So I actually produced a paper that looked at this issue for the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative in relation to Somalia as a case study. But what we found in that case, and you see it in many other contexts across the world, is a lot of tensions between local humanitarian actors and international humanitarian actors. Some people frame it as essentially a neo-colonial enterprise where internationals come in, they're trying to implement programming, but they're not involving locals as much as they can and as much as they should. They're creating a system that doesn't necessarily build up that local capacity and situate local capacity in order to be self-sufficient in the future. So it winds up creating a system where there's somewhat breeding dependence in the long term. So there are absolutely a lot of tensions that are an important part of the access story there. Let me go to some raised hands. And so I'm going to call on Jeremy. I see this hand up first. So Jeremy, you can unmute yourself and ask your question via audio. So have your finger on the unmute button. And I think this should work. It looks like you're unmuted. So Jeremy, go ahead, please, your question.
Hey Rob, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I just wanted to briefly ask if in your research, I mean, you made a very good link to the current Corona situation. Do you have any kind of data or insights that you could share how this relates also to the tendency or the need of humanitarian organizations to negotiate online? Do you see any differences when we're talking about the framework that is being used, distributive or integrative, how this changes when humanitarian organizations are forced to negotiate via digital means because of a lack of access, lack of security issues whatsoever. If you could shed some light on that, thank you so much.
Sure, thanks a lot for your question. Many of the interviewees that I spoke with, I've conducted a lot of interviews with humanitarian negotiators, have talked about some of their engagements online and how that opens up a benefit if you cannot access the people physically to still engage with them online, but also a challenge in that the negotiation, one important factor about it is building an interpersonal relationship with the person that you're negotiating with, especially if you're going in with an integrative approach, which tends to be what many humanitarians adopt, and you're hoping to build trust with your counterpart and try to open them up so that they can engage in a very frank and open exchange about what their interests are and what their bottom lines are. And that, of course, if you're engaging with them online, it's much more difficult to do that than it is if you're talking with them in person. I suppose my comment is simply just to acknowledge and validate that as certainly an obstacle that I've heard many humanitarian negotiators discuss.
Rob, can I chime in here too?
Please do.
I just want to agree with you that on one hand, it lets people across the world really communicate with each other regularly in a way that they might not be able to do otherwise. But informal negotiations, sort of grabbing people in the hallway and pulling them aside, those sort of day-to-day interactions when you have coffee, when you're getting together at a conference, those can be really important too. So there's really a trade-off there. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I'm going to go to the hands. I see one more hand up, which is Kay's. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but you'll tell me in a moment when you unmute yourself. But please do unmute yourself. And there you go. Please ask your question.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you very much, Rob. Thanks for this program for Harvard Institution. It's amazing to be able to share all those thoughts. I'd like to hear from you. How could we use the distributed the strategy approach in in-home discussions of protocols about the COVID-19 with family and friends? You know, I mean, like, I understand the integrity, but how could you use some pressure? What kind of pressure we could use? There is no trials, you know, and laws enforcement. So I'd like to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you for your question. So what I wrote about in the publication that I mentioned that came out a couple months ago on this topic is basically I brought in a framework that was articulated by someone from the negotiation field named Michael Ben Alil. He's from Singapore, or he teaches at a school in Singapore. And he introduced a notion that is, I think, a useful way to capture the wide array of disparate approaches that we see in negotiation scholarship. But the notion that he articulated is that there are 4 types of negotiation capital. There's cognitive capital, emotional capital, social capital, and cultural capital. So what I have seen in many people who have been having these discussions about taking social distancing seriously, trying to convince people to take the risk seriously, is that people come in very well armed with the cognitive capital, but that they have not necessarily considered these 3 other types of capital: the social, the emotional, the cultural. And by that I mean, for emotional, it's sort of, how do you want to set the emotional tone of this conversation? I think a lot of people come in and it's sort of like they're sort of annoyed and they're prepared to be sort of angry and I think you'd said apply pressure. They're sort of, you know, prepared to sort of seem like they're applying pressure. But there are other tools at your disposal. So what I encourage people to do is to sort of check in about your own emotions and see what comes up that you want to express in that conversation, whether it's, you know, that you want to really make an appeal, that what you're saying is really coming from a standpoint of caring about the person and making sure that they're safe. Or there are other options as well. In terms of the social dimension, you can think about who maybe is the best interlocutor to be having this engagement. Maybe it's not you. Maybe there's someone else in your social network that is better poised to influence this person you're trying to reach. And it's about doing a bit of a network analysis to find out who else can you bring into this discussion. So it's not just you trying to convince someone, it's other people as well. And the cultural dimension is just thinking about what are the values that this person holds dear, and how can I maybe frame the discussion in terms of those values. So those are some of the types of things on my mind. I will say also, as a caveat, I mean, not everybody can be persuaded. Especially here in the US, it's a very highly polarized topic of discussion. So it brings up a lot. But I do think that if one considers that full array of negotiation capital at your disposal, and before you go into the conversation, you think a little bit about each of those 4 areas and how you might draw from each of those 4 areas. A little bit of preparation and thinking can help one out.
Rob, we are unfortunately out of time. So let me say, by way of closing things out, thank you, first of all, to Aria and Rob for these terrific presentations. And I'll just flag very quickly 2 features that I think are reflective of PON research in general. One is a very clear focus on the practice of negotiation, not just theoretical models, but a deep interest in how negotiations play out in the real world, whether it's the high seas or humanitarian access. I think it's a nice illustration of that. And then second, as the questions I think illustrate, the research is necessarily deep, but the implications go well beyond the specific subject matter that they are researching. So thank you to both of you for these terrific presentations. Thank you again to Susan Hackley for convening us, to Diane and Anna for handling all the logistics. And finally, I'll just say thank you to all of you for joining us today. We've had terrific participation from all over the world, as you can see from the comments. And so we thank you for that, and we look forward to further sessions going forward. Have a good rest of the afternoon here from Boston. I'll sign off now.